Hey guys, this is Dana, and in this video, I'm going to be going over whether or not codependency is in the DSM. So, if you're not familiar with the term the DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the kind of the go-to book or the quote-unquote Bible for mental health professionals. And in this book, it lists out all different types of mental illnesses and personality disorders, along with the different criteria that a person needs to be presenting with in order to be assessed and diagnosed with those. So either a mental illness or a personality disorder or both, because people are people and everybody's individual. So a person, they might have more than one thing going on with them, which is oftentimes very, very common. So a person could have a mental illness. They could be, let's say they could have schizophrenia, but they could also have personality disorders on top of that. And it can be very difficult oftentimes or they could be bipolar, and then they could also have, some sort of personality disorder, or they could have several different types of personality disorders, or they could have several different types of mental illness going on. So it can be it's not a very cut and dry thing. That's oftentimes a very difficult thing for mental health professionals to untangle and see what's going on there, especially if a person also has a co-occurring substance use problem, because that can manifest as either a mental illness or a personality disorder. So people are complicated, and this book it's an interesting book. Like I said, it lists out everything. So and the book is continually being updated. So it grows and changes. Words and terms are added to it. Words and terms are taken out of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that those different diagnoses are no longer valid or legitimate. It might mean that they've just been recategorized. So, for example, the categorization of multiple personality disorder is no longer in there, but it's been replaced with dissociative identity disorder. There have been some, and there's changes, there's all kinds of changes. There's changes with autism spectrum disorders recently. There's been talk of them removing, kind of in order to clarify things, removing the concept or the term of narcissist. What they would replace that with, I don't know. But that doesn't mean that narcissists don't exist. It just means that that term is going to be redesigned and reshuffled around, much like the terms sociopath and psychopath, right? So those terms were in the DSM. They were then combined. Now they're under the umbrella of they've kind of been renamed completely, actually, with the name antisocial personality disorder. So in this book, it's not an exact science, because a person has to meet just a handful of criteria for each one in order to actually have that different diagnosis. So just because something's not in the DSM doesn't mean that it's problematic. And just because something is in the DSM doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% accurate. So it's just, it's a book written by human beings. It's infallible, and it does change and evolve as understandings change and evolve. So with that said, codependency is currently not in the DSM, although in 1986, a psychiatrist by the name of Timian Cermak proposed that he felt like it should be. And he felt that it should be a personality disorder listed in there. And he proposed a handful of criteria for the disorder, quote unquote disorder, of codependency. So I'm going to go through those. There's 5 main ones and then like 10 subcategories to it. So I'm going to go through those, and then I'm going to go back through those and then just kind of give my take, my impression, my understanding of it. And I think maybe that'll better help to kind of break it down. So the criteria that he proposed for codependency being in the DSM. So number 1, continued investment in the ability to control both oneself and others in the face of serious adverse consequences. Number 2, assumption of responsibility for meeting others' needs to the exclusion of acknowledging one's own. Number 3, anxiety and boundary distortions around intimacy and separation. Number 4, enmeshment in relationships with personality disordered, chemically dependent, other codependent, and or impulse disordered individuals. Number 5, 3 or more of the following. Number 1, excessive reliance on denial. Number 2, constriction of emotions with or without dramatic outbursts. Number 3, depression. Number 4, hypervigilance. Number 5, compulsions. Number 6, anxiety. Number 7, substance abuse. Number 8, has been or is the victim of recurrent physical or sexual abuse. Number 9, stress-related mental illnesses. Number 10, has remained in a primary relationship with an active substance abuser for at least 2 years without seeking outside help. So, before I kind of get any further, with all this talk about the DSM and everything, we can talk about abusive people and emotional abuse and all of this, but it can be really difficult to get an accurate diagnosis as far as whether or not a person is in fact, I think codependency is one of those things. It's a more widely used term, and people, I think probably because it's not in the DSM, ironically enough, mental health professionals are more inclined to use it, because if they do use the label of, well, this person is a narcissist, this person is an antisocial, they are a sociopath, they are potentially opening up themselves for a lawsuit, right? So I think that's one of the many reasons that a lot of mental health professionals might shy away from actually using that term. So, and again, like because it's an art, it's not so much a science. A person has to present with different behavior, and oftentimes manipulative people do a really great job at manipulating. So if they go into the office of a mental health professional, there's a really good chance they're going to put on a really great act and potentially snow this person who doesn't, I mean, of course, the mental health professional doesn't know them. So they're not going to know what's going on, and if the partner is incredibly manipulated by them, it's just another form of added crazy making. So many different layers of complexity here, but just kind of for the sake of clarity, only a licensed mental health professional can assign the diagnosis of a different personality disorder. But with that being said, the personality, these labels, especially when we're talking about personality disorders, these labels, these are pointers to behavior. So it's not necessarily the label that's important, it's the behaviors that are important. So if you are experiencing a bunch of highly problematic behavior to you, no matter what it is, really no matter what it is, because this is you and this is your life, and what might be okay for somebody else might not be okay for you, right? So if it's highly problematic for you, if your partner's not ready, willing, or able to change, then it's okay for that to be deal breaker behavior. I think a lot of people tend to get caught up with needing that validation from other people that it's okay for them to walk away. And this is 100%, all about you, all about knowing yourself well enough to know what is deal breaker stuff for you. Okay, so with that said, let me run back through the list and then I'll kind of give you my 2 cents on it, okay? So number 1, continued investment in the ability to control both oneself and others in the face of serious adverse consequences. The way that I have seen this play out has been, so when I was working at the domestic violence shelter, we saw this time and time again. And I see this fairly often in the support groups as well. So if a person is in, especially a physically abusive relationship, if they've been in it for any length of time and they're staying, then that behavior that they're experiencing, that physical abuse, is now the new normal. So what once registered as highly problematic, scary, dangerous, destructive behavior is not that anymore. It's now normal. And so in order for things to register as really problematic, for them to get away and to get themselves to a place of safety, this person, the problematic person's behavior, really has to escalate to an extremely dangerous level. And unfortunately, this is how many people end up getting put in the hospital or killed, because it's not, they might be thinking to themselves, well, but he or she has hit me before, they've choked me before, they've, tried to run me off the road before, they've done all of these terrible things before. This is just how we fight. So I'm used to it. Like, it's okay for me to meet up with them, or it's okay for them to come over and talk after they've just threatened my life, or it's okay for me to go meet them in the middle of nowhere because they want to talk, or things like this, that to a person that's not in that situation. If you're not in that situation, it's much easier to see it clearly and to think, this is really, really dangerous. What are you doing? But if they're in the middle of that, that's just their new normal. But the problem is with especially with dangerous or destructive behavior like that, it tends to escalate. So just because a person, and this sounds terrible even saying it, right? But just because that might be how they normally fight, if they normally choke them or hit them or do whatever, that behavior tends to escalate. And just because a person didn't go to the hospital or die or have other consequences before doesn't mean that they won't down the road. So it's really important, if for a codependent person, so a lot of codependent people tend to have this idea of, how did he put it? This investment in the ability to control oneself and others in the face of serious adverse consequences. They think that they still have control over an uncontrollable, out of control situation. So always, 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 the default position always needs to be to move ourselves to a place of safety and sanity. Go with your gut, always err on the side of caution, even if other people think you're being drama, even if you think you're being drama, even if, go with your gut feeling. If you feel like you're in danger, especially when a person has already proven that they are dangerous, then you need to do what you need to do to get yourself to a place of safety, okay? So point number 2, assumption of responsibility for meeting others' needs to the exclusion of acknowledging one's own. So this is the whole kind of sinking ourselves in order to help somebody else swim, all at the sake of keeping the relationship afloat. So this is real classic codependent kind of behavior. It's this excessive caretaking. Like, I will just bend over backwards to make you okay, to meet the other person's needs, to make this relationship work. And it's generally, reading books on self-help. It's going to marriage retreats. It's trying to manage the other person's behavior by changing our own. So maybe being extra nice and trying to be a good wife or a good husband, and going above and beyond with the hopes that if we are just a good enough partner, that our partner will treat us in a loving way. But that's not how things work. So, okay, number 3, anxiety and boundary distortions around intimacy and separation. So a lot of codependent people tend to have this definite blurred boundary distortion. It's all about the other person, and this anxiety about separation. This tends to be very clinging kind of behavior. It's holding on to this relationship when the other person is obviously not emotionally invested in this relationship at all. They're lying, they're cheating, they're stealing, or doing any one of those things is deal breaker behavior. But they're doing things that show that they're not working as a team. Okay. But the codependent person feels addicted to them. They have this real blurred sense of boundaries. They might feel sorry. They often feel sorry for the abusive person, thinking, well, they can't control themselves. It's due to their bad childhood, or it's due to the alcohol, or it's due to maybe I'm just really difficult. Maybe, of course, and oftentimes the manipulative, abusive person is telling us that we're the problem. So it's a lot to sort out and untangle. Number 4, enmeshment in relationships with personality disordered, chemically dependent, other codependent, and or impulse disordered individuals. So it's the same kind of thing. So this enmeshment, it's feeling responsible for another adult. It's this excessive caretaking and motion. It's, it's not equal. So I think a more kind of common understanding would be, if you've got an alcoholic spouse and then the codependent spouse is calling in sick for work for them, they are enabling this bad behavior. They, it's this idea of, it's you and me against the world, and I'll just make everything okay. and we're going to get you fixed, but this other person may or may not have any desire to get fixed. So, but the codependent person, often it's this idea of commitment at all cost. And oftentimes the cost is at their emotional and physical safety and sanity. So that's not healthy, right? So a healthy relationship has deal breaker behavior. You don't have to sacrifice your dignity or your self-respect to stay in a relationship. And if you're finding yourself caretaking another grown adult, like, that's a problem, right? That's not an equal dynamic. Okay, so number 5, 3 or more of the following: excessive reliance on denial. So codependent people, queens and kings of denial, right? So we oftentimes justify, minimize, deflect, deny their bad behavior. And this is what burns a lot of other people out. So other people around us don't want to hear about it anymore because we're oftentimes minimizing or just flat out denying this bad behavior, telling ourselves, well, it's this person's acting in this way because of work, because of stress, because there's a new baby, because. But the real reason is they're acting that way because that's their behavior, and they think that it's okay to act that way. So, and it's really interesting if you've ever had a friend, because it's so much easier to see in other people, right, than it is to see within ourselves. But if you've been in the support group, if you've talked to other people that have been in really unhealthy relationships, and how the level of which they deny what is going on, and minimize it. I think really any Jerry Springer episode shows this, right? So you have the person if you have to bring your partner to Jerry Springer or a show like that to get a paternity test, like that's like one of many problems in the relationship, right? So, but these people that go on there, they have been so lied to, and they're so confused, and they so want to believe their partner, because if they don't believe their partner, if they accept the fact that this person has multiple children by multiple partners and is doing all kinds of crazy stuff behind their back, if they accept that that is the reality, that their partner really does have all this problematic behavior, and that there's no other excuse for it, right? They can no longer blame the other woman, they can no longer lie about it. Then to the codependent person, they're running out of options. They're running out of ways to justify staying in this relationship, which is really scary for a codependent person, because codependent people that's that whole commitment at all costs. So they cling on to this relationship, and they oftentimes will settle for any lie that they're told because they just want a reason to stay. So they want, and the kind of this motto for a manipulative person is, well, what are you going to believe, like me or your lying eyes, right? And to a codependent person, they're going to be more inclined to be like, well, there must be a problem with me and my lying eyes, because it can't be my partner, because if it's my partner, then that means the relationship's unhealthy and it means I need to actually leave. But I don't want to leave because I feel addicted to them. I need them. So that's this real dysfunctional dynamic, right? Okay, so number 3, depression. So a lot of codependent people tend to have depression because they're in these really unhealthy situations, especially if they're doing all the work. So if they're the only one that's trying to keep this relationship afloat, and the partner just is out doing whatever they're doing, it's exhausting, right? So, but in the mind of a codependent, they might not interpret it that way. They might interpret it as, we've really gone through a lot together. It's, but that's not the reality. The reality is the partner has put them through a lot, and they have been dragged along for it. And now it's up to them to make everything okay. So it wears a person out. It's incredibly depressing, because the irony is codependent people tend to not want to leave a relationship because they don't want to be alone. But the truth is, if you're in a relationship with the wrong person, let alone a manipulative or abusive person, you already are alone. And I will tell you, there's nothing worse. I mean, I speak from experience, like there's nothing worse than being in a relationship with the wrong person. There's nothing more lonely than that. So yeah, tremendous amounts of depression. Hypervigilance. Hypervigilance tends to be questioning everything, wondering, kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop. This is really common for codependent people because you're with a person when who is there's generally always something there, right? So like every few months they find out something new. Oh, he's gotten somebody else pregnant, or oh, he went off and stole $10,000, or oh, he's now in jail, or oh, she's stolen money or opened up a credit card without him knowing. There's always something with manipulative people because they they're not relationship oriented. They just do what they want to do regardless of consequences. But it's really hard for for other people that are in these dynamics to understand that, because we still think that we're in a relationship with the person that wants to act as a team, and we're not. And it's hard for us to see that because it's so opposite and contrary to how we go about things. It often takes many of us decades to even really truly understand that there's people like this in the world. It's like, it's just mind-boggling. So yes, waiting for the other shoe to drop, because the other shoe does tend to drop every few months. Compulsions. So compulsions, this is how this is manifested in my life. Everybody's a little bit different, but for me, it's been this compulsive need to jump in and fix things for other people. So if I have a friend or a person who's in crisis, I will leap before I look. So I might offer time or money or, resources that I might not even have them. So thinking to myself, well, I need to go save them. Like, they're in a really bad situation and they need help. And I would really want somebody to do that for me. So I should really go do that for them. And then next thing I know, I've way overextended myself trying to help them. A lot of codependent people do this. They might give maybe their adult children money that they don't have, and next thing they know, they're eating peanut butter sandwiches until payday, because they can't afford anything because they've given their kids all the money that they have. So things like this, like just overextending ourselves, trying to make other people's lives work. Anxiety. So anxiety, right? So if we're with a manipulative person and the other shoe is we're always waiting for this to drop, that creates a tremendous amount of anxiety because we have no stability in our life. We never know if we're gonna what they're up to. So we never have that reassurance of, is our marriage still going to be intact a month from now? Is somebody else going to show up at our door pregnant? Is our partner going to just up and leave us again because all of a sudden they just now want a divorce out of the clear blue, and then we find out it's because they're cheating, right? Or if they've spent money that they didn't tell us about. So it's that a lot of these feelings, the anxiety, the depression, the hypervigilance, totally understandable. Like, those are very normal responses to a very abnormal situation. But the problem is we tend to not see this as an abnormal situation. We tend to see it as, well, this is just the normal highs and lows of a relationship, but it's not. So, okay, next one, substance abuse. So a lot of codependent people, in order to cope and numb out from their anxiety and their depression and the hypervigilance and all of these feelings with this relationship, they tend to turn to drugs and alcohol. And it tends to be downers, right? So it tends to be alcohol, it tends to be marijuana, it tends to be, it can be even prescription pills. So anti-anxiety meds, like benzos, right? Like Ativan or things like that to sedate them. It can also be food. I think a lot of codependent people tend to gain weight. Additional weight tends to have this protective effect for a person. So a lot of us tend to emotionally eat. So again, it's just ways of coping with a situation that doesn't work because we're not comfortable in actually addressing this situation. Because if we were to actually bring up the issues, then we know that there's a very solid chance that our partner would leave. And for a lot of codependent people, that's the absolute worst case scenario. Okay, so number 8, has been or is the victim of reoccurrent physical or sexual abuse. My 2 cents, I would also add in there emotional abuse. But at the same time, emotional and verbal abuse always, if the vast majority of the time, if not always, precedes physical abuse. So because that behavior escalates. But codependent people tend to have this pattern of getting tangled up with abusive people. So I think there's a lot to this, because in part, with a codependent person, so again, this goes back to like, what is a person's idea of normal? So if a person grows up in a home where, let's say, they were sexually abused or verbally, there's some sort of abuse going on: verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse. If this was going on, as the child was getting older, that might be their new normal. That is their new normal. So outrageous behavior when they start dating might not register, most likely will not register as problematic, because they've already experienced it. Or if a child has experienced extreme abuse in childhood and then they date, so let's say, for example, they were beaten as a child, right? But now they're in a relationship as an adult with a person who's emotionally abusive. They might be telling, I think this is so common, a lot of times they might be telling themselves, well, but it's not as bad as what I went through when I was a kid. So therefore, they kind of invalidate, they minimize, they deny, they justify what they're currently going through, because yeah, this person might, lie and cheat and yell and scream, but at least they're not getting hit. So there tends to be this real skewed perception of boundaries and standards for what's okay, what's deal breaker behavior in their life. A lot of codependent people don't have deal breaker behavior. Again, it's that whole idea of commitment at all cost. So, number 9, stress-related medical illnesses. So this could be any type of disorder where stress exacerbates it. So MS would be an example of that. But on a more lupus, autoimmune type disorders, stress really intensifies that. So psoriasis can be, stress manifests in so many different ways. It could be a person losing their hair. It could be a lot of like GI type issues. So, irritable bowel syndrome or constipation or, weight gain or I think fibromyalgia. I think a big cause of fibromyalgia is, in fact, some form of trauma, some sort of like abusive dynamic that's going on. But again, because a lot of people don't realize that they're in an abusive situation for decades, because this is their new normal, and because too, we all have this idea of what an abusive relationship is, right? So a person might think, well, it's not abusive unless I'm being beaten or raped, right? And even then, they might have this idea of what it means to be beaten or raped. So if those things are not obvious, if it's not like overtly obvious types of behavior, if a person, because a lot of people have this idea that physical abuse is a woman victim or target and a male abuser, and that the woman is getting hit in the face and that she's got bruises all over her face and that this is an ongoing thing. And so if what's happening to them does not meet this picture in their mind of what abuse is, they don't identify it as being abusive. That makes sense, right? So, but the truth is that abuse occurs in many different forms, and emotional abuse, verbal abuse, is some of the worst forms of abuse out there, because it's so it's oftentimes very subtle, and it's the slow grinding down of another person. So verbal and emotional abuse, it's oftentimes cloaked in cruel jokes. It can be name calling. It's not always name calling. So a lot of people think too, well, this person yells at me, but they never call me hurtful names. Well, a person doesn't have to call you a hurtful name. It can be pointing out areas that, you're insecure or sensitive about, like your weight, your age, your height, your hair, your education, your parenting, these kinds of things. Abusive people tend to go for the weak points in their target or their partner. And so a lot of people they just don't identify what's going on. They just think, well, my partner's he's under a lot of stress, or she's under a lot of stress, or she's just kind of a jerk, or it's because she's got a bad childhood, or this, which that all may be true, but it's still not okay to treat another human being that way. So again, like a lot of abuse just goes unidentified or misidentified for a long time, but it can and does lead to many other types of disorders out there. Physical disorders, like I was mentioning, GI disorders, skin disorders, making autoimmune disorders worse. That's just, but really, stress. Heart problems. It goes on and on and on. Like there's a systemic effect that stress has on the body, and it can manifest in many, many different ways. So, So number 10, has remained in a primary relationship with an active substance abuser for at least 2 years without seeking outside help. I would also add to this. So now this is his criteria back in 1986. The concept of codependency has expanded since then. It was originally, like I talked about it in another video, codependency was very closely tied to spouses of addicts or alcoholics, but it's since been expanded to really include any person that stayed in any type of dysfunctional dynamic for any length of time, really. So I would add on to that, it's not just a substance abuser, it's also any type of dysfunctional or dangerous or toxic person. So any other type of emotional manipulator of any kind. So staying in this dynamic without seeking help is highly problematic, because again, back to that point number one, it's excessive reliance on denial, and back to that original number one, it's this idea that they can handle it, that it's not a big deal, even though this person is causing all kinds of financial harm, physical harm, sexual harm, possibly bringing home STDs and, draining the account or spending money that they don't have, or driving them into bankruptcy or opening up credit cards. This kind of disruptive, dangerous behavior, again, it shows itself in many, many different ways. It tends to not just be like one thing, because it's a character trait, right? So how a person does something is how they tend to do multiple things in their life. So if you're with a person that does not have sincere accountability for their actions, and they don't have any remorse, and they feel entitled to do whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it, then that's really problematic. And oftentimes what us who have been in these types of relationships, what we see tends to just be the tip of the iceberg. So personally speaking, with codependency, I think it is, and I think it's a really, really dangerous and progressive disorder. And if left untreated, it can cause death. I think it is such a big deal. I know that might sound really dramatic, but it's true. Either the codependent person, if they stay in this dynamic, they're going to probably numb out, and that is going to accelerate itself, right? That tends to get worse because the other person, their partner's behavior tends to get worse over time, especially when they know that the partner is going to stay. So there's no incentive for this problematic person to change. So as this person's behavior gets worse, the codependent person has to try to cope with it. And because the codependent person tends to hang on to the very bitter end, they have to come up with more and more ways to cope and numb out and deal with this. And oftentimes, I think for a lot of codependent people, it can be this very, this substance abuse continues, and now they've got alcoholism on top of this, and there's drug addiction, and, it's a slow death is what it is. Or they're with the partner whose behavior tends to get worse and worse and worse, and they hang in there, but because they've lost this idea of this sense of what's appropriate behavior, and so now this person's threatening to kill them, or they've taken drastic physical actions, just shy of killing them, like choking them or strangling them, I should say, because choking is when you choke on food, right? And strangling is when another person puts their hands around your throat. Big difference there. So if another person's actually strangled them or has threatened their life, if that's not registering as dangerous, then it needs to be, then this is how a lot of these relationships end up in the person ends up in the hospital, or they end up dying. So it is a huge deal. Codependency, again, it's a behavior trait. So it's our way of interacting with the world. And just like it can be really hard for any other type of person out there to change, it can be hard for a codependent person to change too, because it's not just codependency in this relationship. I think it's really important that we understand that. I didn't understand that for a long time. It's not just in this relationship, it's how we do everything. So it's really important for us to examine our friendships, examine our career choices, examine how we relate to our coworkers, examine, what ways are we have this excessive caretaking or this controlling behavior, thinking that we can fix other people, or clinging to situations that need to go, that aren't serving us at all, and developing appropriate boundaries and standards for what is okay in our life. So I'll be curious to see what you guys have to say about this video down below in the comments. And as always, lots of love to you guys. You are not alone in this. You are not crazy, and you really can move forward and heal. It's just a step at a time, day by day. So take care, and I will talk to you guys soon. Okay, bye.